Welcome to this episode of the Essential Church Podcast, an ongoing conversation about some of the most important issues facing the local church today. I'm your host, Andrew Arndt, and today I want to take you to an interview that we did recently with Scot McKnight and Laura Barringer on their new book called A Church Called Tov, Forming a Goodness Culture that Resists Abuses of Power and promotes healing. Scot McKnight, many of you know, is the author of Jesus Creed, also a very popular blog by the same name. Blogs a lot on early Christianity, the historical Jesus, and things that are happening in the church. And Laura Barringer is a teacher of first and second grade students in the Chicagoland area and is also Scot's daughter, as you're going to learn in this interview. But they co-wrote this book together as a response to the rash of toxic church cultures that we have seen in the last 10 years or so. Of course, toxic church cultures have always been present in the church, but it just feels like it's become more pronounced lately. And so what they do in this book is they diagnose the roots of toxic culture and then talk about what it might look like to develop a culture of goodness. That word tov is the Hebrew word that means goodness. And so what does it look like to create church cultures that are genuinely good? And so this is the first of two conversations. The first conversation, we talk a lot about what toxic church culture is like and how it develops. And in part two, we talk more about how do we develop goodness cultures. We think you're going to be really helped by this one. And so without further comment from me, here's the conversation. Well, we're excited to welcome a couple of our friends to the podcast today, Scot McKnight and Laura Barringer. Scot McKnight is professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary in Chicago, and he writes and speaks widely on early Christianity and the historical Jesus, and he's the author of a number of books, including the very popular Jesus Creed. Laura Barringer, on the other hand, is a teacher of first and second grade students in the Chicago area, and she's the co-author of Sharing God's Love, the Jesus Creed for Children, and they have co-authored the book that we want to talk about today, A Church Called Tov, Forming a Goodness Culture that Resists Abuses of Power and Promotes Healing, which is really a response to the rash of toxic leadership culture we've seen in the church and a prophetic call to reclaim goodness as a core concept for how we lead in congregational life. So Scot and Laura, we are glad to have you today.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
Before we dive into the book that we're going to talk about today, I just want to tell you, Scot, publicly how much your book, Blue Parakeet, helped me at a very formative time in my pastoral ministry when I was trying to empower more women in leadership here at New Life Church. And I recommend this highly to pastors who are struggling still with gender. And I think it's just a small part of the book, but there was a particular chapter in Blue Parakeet that I found very, very helpful. And I just want to give you public praise for the work you did in that book that helped me as a pastor 10 years ago.
Well, thank you. This book has surprised me and the publisher, I'm glad to say.
That's good. That's good. It's always a good situation, man.
It's fun, yeah.
Well, listen, before we get into the content of the book, for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with the both of you, I think it'd be great just to get some context for the book. So for the both of you, would you just tell us a little bit about your experiences in church that led you to write this book?
Well, where should we start, Dad?
You start with being a pest.
Okay. Well, so like you said in the introduction, I'm a teacher. This is not a place that I ever thought that I would be sitting. I didn't set out to write a book. In fact, my dad, as he mentioned just now, called me a pest because I kept pestering him to write it. So going back, I mean, it's to 2018, but I can still remember the moment like it was yesterday when the story broke in the Chicago Tribune here in the Chicagoland area, a story about Bill Hybels and how he had been sexually, I should say at the time, they were allegations against Bill Hybels for sexually harassing women. And the headline caught our attention because it was a church that we had attended for 20 years and Bill Hybels was my pastor. Granted, I met him one time at a church that size. You don't expect to get to know your pastor. You don't see him behind the curtain, what he's really like. But what was really alarming is when we started to read the article and recognize the name of all of the women. We knew them. Most of them were family friends. Many of them, some of them my dad had known for decades. And it was a startling realization that these aren't a group of people that would just come together and lie like the church claimed. But it launched a series of conversations with my dad, who would explain how Willow Creek was not using scripture correctly, that Matthew 18 was not being interpreted the way it should. And I felt like we were learning so much from my dad theologically that it was like everybody should hear from a theologian about the truth and how the church was handling the allegations. And the focus should have been on the wounded, not the institution. And so I became increasingly annoying to my dad and was trying to get him to write about it. And that's really how the whole thing started.
When the story broke, Chris, my wife, and I were on the back porch reading, and I saw it come through on an email from the Chicago Tribune. And I started to read it. I guess I was 2 or 3 paragraphs into it. And I said, Chris, you got to open this letter up, this email up, because it's a story about Willow Creek, and I think it's true. So we began to follow this story. We knew the women. I didn't know Vonda Dyer, but I knew Nancy Ortberg and I knew Nancy Beach. And I thought, these women are not going to tell lies. They are not that sort of people. And then later that night, Laura and I talked. Laura talked with us, and I mean the big theme was, I told them that night, this story is almost certainly true, and everything depends on how Willow Creek responds. So what happened is Laura, as I said, she was a pest. She kept calling, and that wasn't the pest part, but she kept wanting me to write about it. And, you know, I like pastors. I like churches. I'm not a reporter. I'm not an investigator. I can't go out there and start interviewing people. So I sort of thought, you know, I'll do what I can. I'll support the women. And I wrote to the women and I told them I believed them. But I didn't go public with anything because I just felt like I did not know enough to know what I needed to know to write. But we had talked enough that I was sitting in an airport in a lounge, and I sat down and I wrote out maybe 1,500 words to try to put together my thoughts on the church. And it was, let's say, April, 6 weeks or so afterwards, after the event came out, that then I went to Turkey and Greece and Italy with some students. When I came back, I called Laura right away and I asked her what's going on with the Willow story. And she said nothing. And I honestly felt prompted and at the same time convinced that Willow wanted to stall, because the longer the women had to wait, the harder it would be on them to come forward. So I said, I'm going to do what I can do. And I basically converted that thing that I wrote in the Cincinnati airport into a blog post. And I guess I'm happy and proud and sad to say that I know it rifled its way from office to office at Willow Creek that week. And I was glad to get their attention. I'm glad some of them were irritated with me because I wanted to be an irritant to what they were doing. And then I wrote a couple more posts, but it was only later that I read a book on the German pastors and how they responded to the Holocaust that just utterly shocked me. And it made me be totally convinced of the power of sinfulness, even in Christian leaders, that here these pastors in Germany and in the United States, when they're confronted with the truth, don't have the courage to confess their sins the way they call people weekly in their churches to do. And it really stunned me. And so that became a chapter in the book we call False Narratives. So that sort of gave rise to the book as a book. This is the honest truth. Laura wanted me to write this book, and I kept saying, Laura, I'm not a church consultant. We write a book like this. people are going to be calling me. They're going to be wanting me to be on podcasts. We did not know about COVID at the time. And I said, I'm doing other things. I got a job. And it's been 2 years of a fulfilling and satisfying ministry and an unbelievable unmasking of abuses, mostly power abuses in churches that has really shifted my interest and focus in even in what I teach seminary students.
Well, unfortunately, we've seen this play out exactly what you described. We've seen it play out in other large churches where scandal has erupted. Senior leaders, founding leaders are caught in the spotlight of sin and shame. And you detailed in your book, and I told you the story before we went on air, that I've actually shared this particular chapter with a close friend recently who is struggling with their broken relationship in the church. And I said, buy this book, go to this page, read these 2 chapters, and call me back. And when he called me back, he said, this is exactly what's happening. This is what's going on. And you talk about, you were just talking about how Willow Creek made missteps, and they chose to protect the institution instead of the victims. What do leaders do? And I'm asking you just to take us through these chapters here briefly, but what do leaders do when they're caught? How do they mishandle this? How can you address and diagnose an unhealthy, toxic culture when scandal hits the church?
I mean, that's a complex answer, a complex question with a complex answer. Something that really, I can let my dad speak more to the leadership side of it, but something that really bothered me that I would not settle with me was when the Willow Creek story broke and I was seeing the impact that leaders were having on people that I knew, people in the church, the congregants. They believe the leaders, as they should. They believe what the leader says. They believe what the elders say. And when the elder says the women aren't interpreting Matthew 18 correctly, is essentially what the message that the elders gave the Willow Creek congregation. My friends believe that. And so I'm sitting there like, who am I? I'm a teacher and I'm trying to say, it's not right. It's not right. It's not how the Bible should be interpreted. I just couldn't live with the wrong message, not of Christ, being given to people and then people following it.
And I would agree with that. The pastors have an enormous power, as Laura was saying, and they have the capacity to assume a platform and narrate a story that trusting people are going to believe. I want congregants to respond to their pastors that way. I really do. I want them to trust their narratives. But when the narrative is intentionally distorting in order to protect themselves, cynicism is going to rise. And Brady, all you, I found the way Matthew 18 was being used really an irritant, because it's the Bible. That means it's authoritative. And that means if you don't follow this process, then you're really disobedient. So we can ignore you, diminish you, and dismiss what you have to say, which does not logically follow, but it's the way it works. And Matthew 18 basically says, if you have a problem with someone, go to them directly. And they were using that text to say, if a woman thinks that Bill Hybels or whoever sexually took advantage of her, then she has a responsibility to go tell him.
Right.
And I remember thinking, you have got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
Well, this is going to protect the pastor every time. So I basically adopted 2 policies, 2 sort of responses. That number one, always ask who has the advantage if Matthew 18 is used. And then think about it. Is really that what we're doing? Is someone just gaining an advantage? The second thing is, it is never appropriate to require a victim of abuse to confront their abuser privately when that perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator has an asymmetrical level of power
Right.
over that person. And if you add to this that person is not just asymmetrical in power, that person stands there for God.
Yeah.
You are now asking people to fight God.
Yeah.
And I found it awful, and such spiritual abuse, the way Matthew 18 was being used. And I can't tell you the number of people in the last 2 years who've told us that very thing, that I wasn't following Matthew 18, so they dismissed me.
You write in one the way that you talk about both Matthew 18 and 1 Timothy 5:19, which is accusation should be brought in the presence of 2 or 3 witnesses. I loved this. I thought this was really insightful. You said, think about it. Sexual harassment and abuse do not typically happen in the presence of witnesses. One would have to say that this text almost never works for sexual allegations against church leaders. In fact, using Matthew 18 and 1 Timothy 5 in such cases is profoundly unbiblical, and it's harmful to victims of sexual harassment and abuse. I thought that was incredibly helpful and insightful.
So that's what I was hearing in our phone conversations with our family. And I thought, everybody needs to hear this.
Yep.
We need to hear it. We need to hear it from a theologian who knows the Bible, who's spent his life learning and teaching about Jesus. And we need to hear what the truth is, how to interpret a passage like that.
Well,
And it is. I mean, we do have to use some wisdom. I mean, it's the Bible, but it doesn't mean that it applies in every situation.
Right.
We need some wisdom on this. So I'm profoundly grateful for the number of people who've responded affirmatively to my checking, stiff arming the use of Matthew 18 and 1 Timothy 5 in cases of sexual abuse.
So we know a lot about narcissism. That's, a narcissist who's running rampant and the world revolves around them and people are caught in their wake and all that. But you guys help us understand the concept of institutional narcissism. And institutional narcissism, you can have good people individually, elders, trustees, leaders they follow Jesus, they love Jesus, but there's this kind of institutional narcissism that takes over where we have to protect the shield. We have to protect the entity. And so how do good people who follow Jesus, who are part of these institutions, how can we break that institutional narcissism in these times?
Okay.
Our next book is on that.
Do we use the word institutional narcissism?
No, but that's
Okay.
me just working that.
Yeah. Okay. Because I like this. I think I wish I'd have said that. Here's what I think is a sign of institutional narcissism. When you shift from thinking that your church is helpful and ministers to you to where you think your church is the best church in the world and where you think all other churches are inferior and in many ways unworthy of participating in.
Dang.
Let me just say this. I grew up in a church like this because we were fundamentalist Baptists, and I grew up being taught that every other church in my hometown was filled with people who were going to hell, and that we were the only true gospel church in the entire community, other than a very small church plant on the north side of the town that had about 50 people in it.
You were
And
the
they were
remnant.
one of-
Yeah.
The remnant.
That's so let's just not say it's the megachurch phenomenon.
Right.
It can be in small churches. It is that sense that you alone are the true people of God. That is institutional narcissism.
Right.
And it's insidious and it is dangerous because God's church, the body of Christ, is a whole lot bigger than us.
Yeah. The one element of the toxic culture that you guys talk about is narcissism. The other element of it, and I think that it's not just mega churches. I mean, that's what's nice about your book is that you're honest about the context that you come out of. But these abuses of power we've seen in churches of all stripes and all sizes. It's everywhere. And so your book is helpful for us in thinking about that. So if the one side is narcissism, the other side is power through fear. And it's important. I think it's the way that it works with these things is that they live on the razor's edge of difference. Like the darkness is always sort of a shadow of what's good. It's good for us to have accountability in the church and authority structures that work for us. But that's different than a culture of power through fear. Can you unpack a little bit what a culture of power through fear is and how that develops?
You know,
No, since we, let me just say one thing. Since we wrote this book, we have had, it slowed down a little bit, but we were getting letter after letter. There were some that were sexual abuses, but by and large, most of them were power abuse and fear cultures.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got way too many of them. I've got them in my inbox. I want to say, I think this is, and when I wrote this section and worked on it for quite a while, I sent it to Laura. Laura wondered where I got all this stuff on the power. She really liked this section. And I feel like this is an important contribution to church life, this section on power. Power is a very interesting phenomenon that is wielded wisely and recklessly by the same people in the same churches. And we need to be a little bit more conscious of power. And we're working on this with some other categories right now. But one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of churches is, let's just say the pastor is very successful and charismatic and a great preacher and bringing people in, and we got butts in the seat, and we are getting bills in the plate, and we're getting baptisms in the pool, and we're going to have buildings in the future. So we got the bees going for us, and it just seems like everything's right, and people begin to develop that the pastor's a bit of a celebrity, that he's very special, that God has his anointing upon this person, he's blessed this person, and they want to be close to him. And there is such a thrill for so many people to be in that inner vibe and know things that other people don't know, that it becomes almost a shield of pride, that they can't tell other people what's going on. And there's other people who are being tested to see if they're good enough to be in that inner circle. And then there's, it's like a sword that has two sides to it, is that they can cut it open so that they can open it up for you to enter, but they can also cut the other side and push people out. So then it becomes, you're in the presence of this dynamic reality, and if you don't behave, we'll kick you out. Furthermore, it enhances a person's self-esteem to be a part of it. I've had a number of people say, I cannot tell you how many times I pinched myself because I got to work at this church. And that sense, I mean, in one sense, I want to say, I'm great. I'm glad you love what you get to do. But there's another sense in which that becomes a power mechanism.
It's like a drug.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a good analogy.
Intoxicating.
It's a rush.
Yeah.
It's a rush in the...
Or the stories of the closer people would get to the inner circle, the more important they felt.
Yeah.
And the more addictive it was.
Well, and especially when that person who's at the center of the circle represents the presence of God and the Word of God. So that would be true in any social circle where there's a person of influence or charisma or power. But when you add the God element into the mix, that drug-like atmosphere is quite nearly insurmountable unless you are very deliberate in working against it.